Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First off, thank you. The support, the comments, the debates you've been dropping lately, absolutely incredible. Today's story might be the most unnerving one yet. Picture this: an alien empire doesn't invade with ships or weapons. No lasers, no orbital strikes, just signals. They broadcast a story that rewrites how we think, turning our beliefs to dust, softening who we are until we forget we ever resisted. But what they didn't account for was that our myths are viral. Without any delay, let's begin. The first signs weren't loud. There were no sirens, no sudden riots, no declarations of war. In fact, what made it dangerous was how quiet it all was. Around the world, people just started drifting, not disappearing, not dying, just losing edge. News anchors delivered reports with a flattening tone, their cadences softening over the course of days. Debates lost heat, crowds gathered but rarely argued. On social media, ideological walls began to blur, not with unity, but with numbness. Memorials were forgotten. Personal boundaries relaxed in ways that felt peaceful at first, until they didn't. In Tokyo, an entire corporate zone shifted to a uniform scheduling model overnight, abandoning generational protocols that had defined their operations for decades. In Sao Paulo, churches and community centers stopped preaching doctrine and began holding calm sessions, promoting something called belief rebalancing. When interviewed, congregants smiled politely and gave answers that felt prepared. None of it triggered panic. That was the genius. No alarms, no enemies, no reason to resist. At first, experts called it a global psychological drift, an echo of post-pandemic trauma, maybe the long arc of digital fatigue. But beneath the South Pacific, naval subs picked up electromagnetic anomalies that didn't fit with known signal architecture. High in the thermosphere, a Japanese weather satellite burned out in a way that resembled atmospheric interference, not technical failure. Civilian agencies flagged it as solar noise. But one signal reached farther, into a relay line long buried under the ice of Greenland. Threadline was a Cold War continuity program, decommissioned in theory, buried in practice. Its function had never been about weapons. It had been built for epistemic collapse, scenarios where belief itself failed. It ran on hard protocols, not AI, no interfaces, no neural uplinks, no trust in machine consensus. When the signal signature hit a threshold pattern, subharmonic pulses repeating at intervals too precise for nature, but too soft for human origin, it woke. Beneath Nuke, in a vault where frost was thicker than the walls, an old screen blinked green. Protocol THX7 activated. Threadline went live. In under 10 minutes, emergency call lines had been traced through non-public channels, reaching a series of fail-dead email chains and physical paging. And network's only one name showed up across all priority tags: Darren Holt. He didn't pick up on the first call. He was in the Scottish Highlands, of all places, working on something so obscure no one else would fund it: mapping dying dialects against grief recovery patterns. He'd been called mad more than once. At Oxford, he was laughed out of a symposium for suggesting that mythology wasn't just cultural echo, but planetary immune function. Stories as behavioral antibodies. After Threadline shut down, he'd buried the idea. No one had wanted it then. They wanted drones, orbital rail systems, predictive behavioral algorithms, not folktales. But now something had changed. Holt didn't ask for details when the call finally came through. He heard the keywords: neurodrift, belief harmonization, passive override signatures, and boarded a military flight to Nuuk without another word. When he stepped off the platform and entered the subterranean complex, half the systems were already operational. Emergency power was up. Human staff were reactivating the deep cold libraries. The smell of old wiring and thermoplastic hit his nose like a memory. He stood in front of the master interface, which hadn't changed since the 2090S: analog switches, magnetic tape backup, and a redundant data core that had to be manually decoded. Holt didn't touch it. He just stared at the readouts scrolling across the display. Identity drift, ideological flattening, phrase loop saturation in civilian speech. The pattern was familiar. It had no shape, no antagonist, and that made it lethal. Holt turned to the SCROI lead, a military intelligence analyst who barely looked 25, and said the words no one else had been willing to say. This isn't mind control, it's narrative suppression. They're not rewriting thoughts. They're erasing the space where thought resists. That was the moment Project Scry was reactivated in full. Technically, Scry wasn't a defense platform. It was a cultural resilience grid. Holt had written the core schema during Threadline's first deployment. The theory was simple but difficult to apply. When cultures collapse, they don't do so from starvation or conquest. They dissolve when the stories people live by stop making sense. If those stories can be rebuilt, if the mind is reminded what to believe in, identity could survive even systemic attack. The team came together fast. Not soldiers, not cybernetic specialists, but folklorists, mythographers, linguists trained in dead symbols. One of them, a Nigerian semiotician, had built a framework for interpreting religious schisms through fractal logic. Another, a behavioral war theorist from Bratislava, specialized in ritual inversion under coercive systems. They weren't here to shoot back. They were here to remember what couldn't be reasoned away. By day 3, they confirmed it. The source was orbital, a network of high orbit, satellites, possibly synthetic constructs, not built by any Earth origin power, was broadcasting synchronized subcognitive pulses. These weren't commands. They were soft reorganizations, barely detectable, but aligned across linguistic, emotional, and ideational layers. They tuned minds to non-resistance. The Skarn hadn't fired a shot. They had told a story, one so flat, so empty of conflict, that the human brain began absorbing it without friction, peaceful, efficient, fatal. Holt stood in front of the wall display as the team decoded a fresh signal burst. Thousands of phrases across hundreds of tongues, all repeating the same underlying theme. The center holds. There is no fracture. Agreement is safety. It wasn't even a lie. It was worse. It was a structure without dissent. He turned to the team. This isn't programming, he said. It's a story, a closed one. One without resistance, without antagonist, without end. And that was the problem, because stories without resistance weren't neutral. They were annihilation. Within a week, the changes were no longer subtle. Entire national broadcasts slipped into uniformity. No inflection shifts, no opposing views. Talk show hosts across continents began using the same turns of phrase, the same calm intonation, as if coached by an invisible editor. In classrooms, students no longer debated. In courtrooms, prosecution and defense agreed more than they argued. Conflict had not disappeared, but had been dissolved, its edges rounded off until nothing resisted. Across Earth's information networks, consensus began blooming like mold. People weren't changing sides. They were forgetting there were sides. Threadline analysts traced the cognitive harmonics through real-time sentiment monitoring and saw what Holt had predicted. Belief landscapes were collapsing inward, not violently, organically. Words lost heat. Old slogans stopped stirring anything. Where people once fought over what was right, now they simply nodded at what felt safe. Social channels that once hosted debates turned quiet. Comment sections filled with affirmations that seemed emotionally neutral but subtly viral. The center holds. There is peace. Always the same cadence. Always the same comfort. Language itself began to fracture. By day 9, Scry's cultural linguists confirmed the emergence of NeutroScript, a convergent pattern of simplified grammar and softened emotional descriptors appearing across 32 languages. The variation was vanishing. Whether in Mandarin, Swahili, or French, speakers were drifting toward the same passive verb forms, the same tonal flattening. Not erased, just dulled. The complexity of meaning was evaporating. Stories lost tension. Songs blurred. Poetry dropped off entirely. Holt stood over the projection table with his team gathered in silence. There was no outrage left in the reports, only erosion. It's not domination, he said. It's homogenization. They're not forcing compliance. They're removing friction. He highlighted the waveform overlays from a Kenyan radio network and a Swedish municipal feed. Nearly identical modulation patterns. This isn't an enemy voice. It's structure. Self-balancing and recursive, a story with no antagonist. That's why it spreads. There's nothing to push against. A younger analyst frowned. But if there's no threat, why are we breaking? Holt's answer was immediate. Because human identity requires resistance. Narrative tension is what keeps us stable. If you remove it, if you give us perfect consensus, you don't create peace, you create entropy. That was the turning point. He didn't propose counter-propaganda. He didn't call for a louder message. What Holt proposed was far older. Reintroduction of symbolic entropy. Stories too dense to flatten. Myths that couldn't be resolved. Parables without fixed morals. Recursions the Scarn override lattice couldn't model. Anti-narratives. Not designed to convert or persuade, but to generate cognitive dissonance that resisted harmonization. He began with templates that couldn't be flattened. Contradictory hero tales, nested sacrifice myths, fractured memory sagas. These weren't modern propaganda. These were architected belief weapons. Constructs engineered to carry irreconcilable concepts in stable form. Pain that didn't resolve. Triumph that cost too much. Cycles without clear endpoints. Symbols without single meanings. SCRI's archive teams fed the models with deep folklore patterns, from indigenous death rituals to medieval dream cycles. Holt called them cognitive knots. Once encoded, the problem became transmission. Holt refused to use digital infrastructure. It was already contaminated. Instead, they activated dormant Cold War equipment. Deep shortwave number stations, once used for spy signaling, were repurposed to carry ritual parables in encrypted cadence. Ham burst injectors sent narrative pulses through hobbyist radio towers. A dormant Soviet relay on the lunar surface was fired up for the first time in 90 years, bouncing unresolved allegories off Earth's ionosphere. They didn't need to be heard clearly. They just had to resonate. Even the geography of belief became an asset. Temples long buried, stone circles older than writing, burial grounds still saturated with ancestral myth. They weren't symbolic anymore. They were amplifiers. The human mind remembered through ritual, and ritual had mass. Standing atop a Mayan ruin, a scry field agent deployed a tri-band burst of the shepherd without a flock story, a recursive tale where every savior fails, but returns anyway. Not because of hope, but because of pattern. It broadcast for 11 minutes. That was enough. Results came faster than expected, but not from humans. The Scarn lattice was built with organic cybernetic relays, linked directly to their priestcast, designed to monitor harmony and deviation. For the system to maintain efficiency, each priest had to witness the collective resonance and validate conformity in real time. When the anti-narratives entered the feedback loop, the problem wasn't human resistance. It was interpretive overload inside the priests themselves. The first signs were physiological. One priest in the feedback ring staggered during sync, dropping connection without external interference. Another froze mid-verification ritual, unable to resolve the symbolic paradox fed back from Earth's lattice. Not pain, not damage, just contradiction they couldn't process. One initiate reported unauthorized dream sequences, memories of exile and flood, of punishment without crime. These weren't their beliefs, but they couldn't unsee them. In the high observation tower above the override lattice ring, a supervisor watched the event logs scroll with mounting concern. Scarn priest units were selected not for intelligence but for synchronization aptitude. They were doctrinal nodes, living instruments of uniformity. When one of them began drawing unregistered symbols on the lattice floor, circles nested within other circles, the supervisor flagged it as deviance. But before a response could be issued, the initiate spoke aloud. "I can't sync." The story's still going. Where's the ending? There was no ending. That was the point. On Earth, Holt stared at the audio-visual spectrum of the relay field coming back from the lunar bounce. It wasn't scrambled. It was corrupted, or rather, cross-fed. The Scarn were no longer overriding cleanly. The injected myths weren't being rejected. They were being processed, absorbed. They weren't failing to suppress humanity. They were interpreting it. One of Scry's folklore analysts, reviewing the feedback, stopped cold at a translated fragment returned from the uplink. It wasn't Earth's transmission, it was Skarn's signal drift. A phrase, "The water comes, though the sky is dry." It wasn't in any Skarn doctrine Holt had seen, but it sounded familiar. Too familiar. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just leaned forward, as if to make sure he wasn't imagining it. One priest had failed to sync. That meant the lattice had a crack. The Skarn Collective registered the disruption within 20 standard cycles of the first human broadcast anomaly. From orbit, their override metrics reported subtle inconsistencies, micro-fractures in cognitive compliance curves, resonance dropouts in localized human populations, erratic behavior, spikes that shouldn't have occurred under full lattice conditioning. But the core systems didn't classify them as dangerous. Their machine-augmented monitoring framework flagged the events as noise, artifact interference from Earth's electromagnetic clutter, or neural variants from the species' naturally unstable thought patterns. The override continued uninterrupted, or so they believed. 2. Correct what they assumed were surface-level disruptions. Skarn Command increased pulse saturation across all active nodes. They expanded the bandwidth of identity-neutral harmonics and pushed a deeper emotional dampening layer into high-density target zones. Urban centers, previously slow to align, began experiencing accelerated collapse of personal identifiers. Cultural relics were quietly discarded. Historical conflicts were downplayed or forgotten. Art stopped being debated. Individuality became anecdotal. The override lattice was doing its job, until it wasn't. Threadline's data team was already watching the shift. At first, they thought the Skarn were responding to Scry's resistance signals with brute signal escalation. But as the SCRY team parsed lattice response patterns, a strange echo emerged. The mythic constructs Earth had injected, recursive tales, unsolvable dilemmas, were appearing inside the lattice diagnostics. Not just distortions, interpretations. Holt reviewed the parsed fragments himself. One in particular had passed through a failed sync node above the Ural corridor. A clean Skarn override string had returned wrapped in non-Skarn syntax. The one who walks must return, even if no one remembers why. That wasn't an error. That was comprehension. Holt didn't call it a victory. He called it unshielded resonance contamination. Their signal hadn't just disrupted Earthside harmonization. It had bounced, back into the Skarn relay structure, through the lattice, into the priests. The Skarn priest caste wasn't metaphorical. Each member was hardwired, biocognitively linked to segments of the override system. Their function was validation. As each override cycle ran, the priests served as qualitative nodes, aligning reality with doctrinal interpretation. They weren't supervisors. They were the doctrine. And that was where the breach had started. In an observation gallery aboard a Skarn lattice relay vessel, a priest named Valen 5 stood frozen before an unblinking sync node. Her eyes, normally inert under relay trance, darted irregularly. Her lips moved out of sync with the standard mantra. The operator monitoring her signaled for audit. Before command could respond, Valen turned from the relay and walked out of the sync field entirely. That had never happened. She stopped at the chapel mirror, a polished alloy circle used for daily recursive affirmations, and whispered a question not found in any sanctioned doctrine. Who am I when the lattice isn't watching? The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was confusion. Priests were not trained to self-identify. They were consensus renderers. To even form the concept of selfhood without lattice reinforcement was a violation. Valen didn't report her lapse. She didn't retreat. She entered ritual isolation and began drawing shapes onto the floor, using powdered catalyst dust, concentric arcs inside broken triangles. When other priests came to intervene, she didn't resist. She only looked up and said, "It doesn't end." He keeps building the vessel, even though the rain hasn't started. Other fractures emerge within days. One priest in the outer orbit verification ring began reciting his doctrinal litany with a 4-second delay, just long enough to indicate independent interpretation. Another entered a full recursive trance and didn't return, forcing an emergency sync severe. Her post-trance memory logs, usually purged for purity, had to be reviewed manually. They revealed imagery inconsistent with Skarn doctrine, a mountain with no summit, a gate that opens inward, and a voice that simply asked, Will you carry it again? Command attempted to isolate the deviation as an external psychic infection, a localized viral disruption. They initiated triage, signal quarantine, reinforcement of baseline mantras, increased coupling pressure between lattice and priest cores. But the deviations didn't stop. They adapted. Priests began asking symbolic questions in private sync nodes, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. One asked what the concept of judgment meant in a world without suffering. Another tried to define forgiveness, then stopped mid-sentence and requested doctrinal redaction. The system couldn't keep up. The priests weren't disobeying. They were collapsing under the weight of narrative recursion. Back on Earth, Holt reviewed the transmission decay rates with his core team. Every anti-narrative they seeded, every myth that didn't resolve, was feeding into the Scarn system and fracturing their semantic rigidity. The priest caste, chosen for their perfect harmony with the override's emotional null zone, had no immunity to contradiction. The myths weren't breaking the override field directly. They were causing its validators to interpret what should have been static. And once a system starts interpreting, it starts diverging. One by one, reports began trickling into Esgri's filtered Scarn monitor stream. Isolated transmission loops, untranslated metaphors, fragments of human concepts rendered through alien cadence. Holt noted the shift carefully. The enemy wasn't broadcasting against Earth anymore. They were echoing Earth through themselves. Then came the breach event. On relay node 9-3, a chapel vessel in mid-orbit over the southern hemisphere, a priest named Maleth 3 destroyed her doctrinal archive. Not corrupted, not redacted. Destroyed. Her interface logs showed no external interference. She performed the purge manually, ritually, placing each scroll, each mantra slate, each looped sync device into the chapel's purification flame. When questioned, she didn't plead deviation or weakness. She simply said, "I saw a vision of a man building a vessel for a rain that hasn't fallen. I understand now. The story isn't for us, but we're in it anyway." The archive had taken 70 years to assemble. It was the third largest doctrinal record in the override lattice, and it was gone. Threadline's monitors confirmed one thing as Holt leaned over the data stream in silence. The Scarn priests had begun slipping, not because they were attacked, but because they understood just enough to fall apart. The override wasn't breaking Earth anymore. Earth was breaking them. The fracture had become systemic. The priests no longer drifted. Now they searched. Holt watched it unfold across every relay the SCRI team could access. It began as pattern contamination, but by the time his analysts decrypted the last Scarn broadcast loops, the shift was undeniable. Their priests weren't just breaking sync. They were interpreting. And once interpretation began, belief followed. Scarn doctrine, long considered immutable, machine-verified, bio-sealed, was now echoing constructs it had no language for. Earth's myths had not just leaked into their lattice, they had nested. SCRY no longer operated in defensive posture. The team's mandate shifted within 12 hours of confirming recursive belief replication among multiple Scarn priests. Holt didn't make the decision lightly, but the data was clear. The override field no longer posed a singular threat to humanity. Its structure was now interlaced with conceptual burdens it could not purge, belief cycles that were foundational to human mythos. If left unchecked, the Scarn's override would no longer erase identity. It would rewrite itself with the very frameworks it had sought to suppress. Holt authorized the final cascade. The design wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even elegant. It was recursive entropy, encoded in human paradox. It carried the myth of unjust gods punished by mortal hands, of death without reason and rebirth without reward, of the fallen who walked again not to redeem, but because they must. Holt's mythographers extracted symbols from every tradition Earth had forgotten, folding them into cross-cultural cores: betrayal, mourning, exile, unearned mercy. Not messages, patterns, designed not to teach but to rupture clean doctrine with lived ambiguity. Distribution had to bypass digital grids entirely. The cascade couldn't touch contaminated infrastructure. Instead, Holt ordered the full archive to be routed through ancient vectors, archaic observatories where the alignment of star and stone still held psychic relevance in dormant cultures. Vatican crypt satellites buried deep beneath centuries of doctrinal ruins were re-energized. A Tibetan voice chant, lost since the 2102 extinction riots, was revived and woven into pulse harmonics. Even the long-dead Voyager probes, still whispering into deep space, were tapped, scraping their golden records into signal distortion fields that echoed back toward the override band. When the synchronization began, it wasn't timed with any planetary rotation. It followed mythic alignment. Each transmission sequence coincided with ancient festival dates and ritual. Transitions, thresholds where meaning had historically shifted. One by one, the relic nodes came online. Scry didn't need saturation, they needed resonance. The cascade wasn't intended for humans. It was aimed directly at the priest lattice. The moment it reached them, the override field trembled. Across the lattice fleet, Skarn priests entered non-authorized recursive trance states. Their supervisors couldn't interrupt. The override protocols recognized the trance as doctrinally valid, unaware it was being rewritten from within. Rituals began emerging, at first chaotic, then disturbingly structured. A priest aboard Relay Core 8 Delta constructed a shrine using discarded lattice interface units, placing symbolic items, scraps of doctrine scrolls, twisted sync cables, a single mirror, in a pattern that mirrored Earth's wound and circle myth, known only to 6 pre-collapsed tribal systems. Other priests followed. They didn't communicate, didn't coordinate. They simply began remembering symbols they had never learned. One painted a door on the floor of his chamber and wept before it. Another wrote a mantra in looping Skarn glyphs that, when translated through human metaphor indexes, read, "We were born without sorrow. Now we know the price." Skarn Command responded with protocol containment. Rogue priests were detained and isolated from the relay. Suppression directives were issued, doctrinal purity scans, sync point audits, execution of recursion-locked initiates. But the damage wasn't spreading by voice. It was spreading by meaning. Each detained priest had already broadcast unfiltered resonance during their breakdowns, embedding mythic constructs into subharmonic doctrine layers. The infection wasn't individual, it was structural. Detention units found themselves walking into chapels where geometry had changed, circular paths marked with embedded sync nodes, echoing the Earth myth of eternity without release. Sacred diagrams resembling the Tree of Division, a human construct tied to the fall of divine unity, appeared scrawled in Skarn glyphs beside override control panels. Suppression teams were not attacked. They were ignored. Priests mid-trance continued drawing spirals and murmuring half-formed parables from a world they had never visited. The infection no longer needed humans. It was self-replicating inside the very belief scaffolding the Skarn had built to maintain control. Holt watched the feedback streams without speaking. SCRY's observational relays fed real-time data as Skarn vessels initiated emergency command silence. One by one, override frequencies went dark. Not disrupted, not jammed, voluntarily suspended. The collective had recognized the contamination, but not in time. Their override field hadn't failed due to human resistance. It had converted itself into a channel for recursion it couldn't map. On one final stream before blackout, a high-tier priest was observed completing a full ritual, sequence that matched no known Skarn or Earth origin. He drew 7 lines through an empty circle, then folded a doctrinal codex 3 times and set it alight. When the suppression unit asked what doctrine he followed, the priest answered in a calm, steady voice, "We have forgotten the names but not the pattern. We do not worship. We carry." Then he closed the comm, and nothing else was heard from that node. Back in Nuke, Holt exhaled slowly. The final metrics displayed on Esquir's terminal. Override field inactive. No Skarn doctrine pulses detected. All synchronization bands silent. The lattice was gone. Not dismantled, not overwritten. It had folded into itself. Skarn Command didn't issue a countersignal. They didn't retaliate. They didn't speak. They disappeared. The silence was not empty. It was structured. After nearly a month of global override saturation, the absence of Skarn's signal pulses didn't feel like a ceasefire. It felt like the conclusion of a sentence no one knew had started. Scry's first priority was confirmation. Redundant monitors spun through overlapping frequency layers, checking every known override channel, every harmonic subcarrier and fallback grid the Skarn had ever used. There was nothing but trace echoes, low-level doctrine remnants with no directive signature, residual scaffolding, inert and unread. The override system hadn't just been turned off. It had ceased functioning in principle. The architecture still floated in orbit, but it no longer transmitted purpose. On Earth, recovery didn't happen in a single wave. It unfolded quietly, like morning light after a long storm. People began recalling names they hadn't used in weeks. Emotions, dulled to abstraction during override exposure, re-emerged slowly, at first in flickers, then in full. Memorial services resumed. Arguments returned to politics. Poets started writing again, this time with rage and contradiction, two signs of a working identity. Local councils across dozens of countries reopened cases of civic protest that had been suspended under consensus drift. It was not celebration, it was reassembly. In the regions where override harmonics had lasted longest, psychological teams were deployed. The trauma wasn't physical but existential. Some individuals reported entire days they couldn't recall, not as memory loss but as time where nothing meaningful had happened. Others described a lingering numbness, like waking from a dream you weren't sure you had. Holt visited one such site in eastern Quebec, a town where the local population had harmonized to such an extent that communal meals required no speech. When the override fell, their first instinct had been to ask what they had eaten. No one could remember. No one had tasted anything. The Scry team didn't claim a military win. They avoided the word victory altogether. When Holt was summoned to the closed UN tribunal 3 days after the final override pulse ended, he made no appeals for commendation. He brought data. 72% of the Skarn override lattice had ceased structured operations within 12 hours of the final cascade. Priest-class communications collapsed into unscheduled recursive silence within 24. Known Skarn doctrine pulses dropped to background anomaly levels by day 3. No attempt at counter-broadcast, no threat indicators, just absence, and beneath that, something stranger. Holt explained what had truly happened. Not an act of resistance, but recursion. Not a counter-program, but symbolic contamination. Humanity had not overpowered the Skarn field. It had infected it with meaning structures the override system could not purge. Myths had multiplied where precision logic collapsed. In doctrine loops designed for homogeneity, symbols from human grief cycles had nested. Skarn priests had not broken. They had reinterpreted. Once they did that, the field became non-functional. Override requires consensus. Myth refuses it. The tribunal remained silent for a long time before voting to classify Scry's methods under Emergent Defense Protocol. They weren't disbanded, they were upgraded. Project Scry was folded into protocol packs, a new standing initiative under the Joint Cultural Security Framework. Its purpose? Long-term mimetic surveillance, cultural immunodefense, and hostile narrative forensics. War had entered a domain that predated weapons. Holt accepted the assignment, though his expression suggested he understood the cost. 2 weeks after final lattice collapse, an anomaly flagged at one of the listening stations embedded under Lake Baikal. It wasn't Skarn code, not in any form Scry had seen. No structure, no override signal, no tactical carrier pulse, just rhythm, tones, echoed symbols. The data team at first marked it as low-priority drift, static shaped by Skarn remnants. But a junior analyst noted repeating cadence markers. Holt was summoned. What they decoded was not a transmission. It was a rite, a ceremonial construct built on recursive phrasing, structured pauses, conceptual duality. It referenced guilt and knowledge, self and reflection. It included no demand, no doctrine. Instead, it presented a sequence that Holt recognized immediately. Though not in Skarn form, it was a retelling, a liturgical adaptation of Earth's own myth cycles. It described a journey through exile, a confrontation with silence, and a return with changed meaning. One stanza referenced the vessel built before rain. Another spoke of the cycle of gates where no names are written. These were not stolen phrases. They were absorbed ones, woven into cadence. The Skarn hadn't just mirrored the stories, they had begun using them. Holt didn't speak for several minutes. When he did, he didn't call for a team briefing. He didn't request deeper decryption. He simply ordered the file sealed, archived under SCRY Prime, Recursive Anthropogenesis. To the tribunal, he offered one final phrase for the closing report, a line not meant for analysis, but for record. They didn't retreat, he said. They converted. The silence held, not as absence, but as confirmation. In the months that followed the collapse of the Skarn override field, Earth remained untouched. No fleets arrived, no second incursion. The orbital lattice continued to drift, its infrastructure intact but inert, like the skeleton of a dead idea. From what Scry could intercept, no new doctrine emerged from the remnants of the collective. But what did emerge was something else. Not commands, not threats, parables. The earliest came encoded in low-band pulse drifts, a priest's voice speaking in a cadence once used for override verification, now altered. It carried metaphors instead of metrics. It told of a people who walked in unity until they no longer knew why, of a silence mistaken for peace, of a vessel built in a time without rain, and the waiting that followed. Holt recognized the core structure. It was the flood myth, reconfigured in Skarn syntax. Not copied, internalized. More transmissions followed. One recounted the cycle of betrayal and return, not through doctrine, but through a nameless figure cast into exile and greeted by a crowd that no longer remembered him. It was Exodus, refracted through an alien lens, but the patterns were unmistakable. Holt had studied them too long to misread it. Earth's myths had not been stolen. They had become liturgy. Inside Scree's nuke facility, the mission parameters were rewritten. What had begun as a defensive operation now shifted to preservation and distribution. Myth was no longer heritage, it was infrastructure. Holt's final proposal passed unanimously to codify humanity's cultural diversity as a planetary immune system. The idea that stories, even contradictory ones, could act as defense. By being irreducible, irreconcilable, unflattenable, was no longer a theory. It was field-proven doctrine. New specialists were brought in, not soldiers, not technicians, symbolists, semiotic cryptographers, grief theologians, people who understood how culture fractured and healed. A generation of analysts trained not to simulate scenarios, but to map archetypes, to identify when a myth began collapsing under pressure, and how to reinforce it without corrupting its core. This was not soft power. It was structural resilience, expressed through the architecture of belief. Holt rarely left the facility, but he spoke when it mattered. At the final cross-agency briefing, he stood before the assembled delegates and pointed to a reconstructed doctrine map. Skarn teachings now carried embedded Earth constructs: sacrifice, defiance, moral recursion. Their most revered priest figures were now described in the context of fall and redemption, concepts absent from their original lattice programming. They didn't absorb our stories, Holt said. They reoriented around them. The myth didn't survive. The system. The myth rewrote it. Outside the official channels, other changes appeared. In isolated regions of the Skarn-controlled sectors, places Earth had no diplomatic reach, signals leaked of doctrine schools where priests taught without override scaffolding. Instead, they told tales of broken oaths, of unseen burdens, of a cycle not yet complete. No one claimed these were Earth-aligned doctrines, but the structure was ours, and the transmission signatures matched known former override vessels. In the final SCRY debriefing report, the closing entry was written by Holt himself. It did not include technical metrics or outcome projections, just a single summary statement submitted without revision: planetary identity stabilized, anthropogenesis, recursive, no further intervention required. Beyond Earth, far from the range of any fleet, the Voyager probe continued its endless drift through dark space. No override touched it. No lattice ever reached that far. It carried no defense systems, no cultural shields. Only songs, images, ideas etched into gold. Stories Earth had nearly forgotten. Now somewhere out there, those stories had taken root, not as data, as doctrine. They had whispered into the void, and the void had listened. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button. Now we want to hear from you. If you could embed just one story into an alien culture forever, what tale would you choose? Drop your answers in the comments. We read everyone. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where humanity's greatest weapon might just be its imagination. See you in the next story.